Hello, I'm Juliet Mann, and this is the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. China and the EU end 2024 in something of a difficult situation as the row over electric vehicle tariffs threatens to undo much of the goodwill built up by Xi Jinping's summer trip to Europe and visits to Beijing by a number of EU leaders over the last 12 months. So with the 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties coming up in May, just where do relations stand between two of the world's biggest trading partners? Joining me now are John Clarke, former Director for International Affairs at the EU Commission and former head of the EU delegation to the WTO and United Nations. Yin Zhiguang, Professor of International Politics at Fudan University, and Finnish MP and former Minister of Transport, Timo Harakka. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming on the agenda. John, let's start with you. How would you describe the relationship between China and the EU? After all, during 2024, there was even more talk, wasn't there, of de-risking rather than decoupling?
It's a complicated relationship. It's been very poor in the last decade. I think on the Chinese side, politically, they see the EU as being very hypocritical on Palestine, hypocritical on climate change, and on the EU's claim that NATO is a purely defensive organization. So a lot of problems. There is a lot of, however, mutual dependence between Europe and China. 2.3 billion euros a day is traded between the two blocks. So we are mutually dependent in a way that I would say USA and China are not. You mentioned de-risking. That's something that both sides are doing for very good reasons, prudential reasons. Ever since COVID, we've understood the need to de-risk. But that's not decoupling. And China and Europe will not and should not and cannot decouple. We need to cooperate. Yep. And I think the new Commission, just come into office the last couple of weeks, is a very, very good opportunity for a rethink about future EU-China long-term relations. And a very good moment to update the strategic relationship, recognizing that China is a global power and that we are now in a multipolar world, like it or not.
Yin, I wonder what you think about that, because China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that China's diplomacy in 2024 had created a sound external environment for China's high-quality development and injected valuable stability into a volatile world. So I wonder where you think we're seeing that with regard to the EU in particular.
On the official statement level, China has always been very consistent in terms of its attitude towards the world as well as towards the EU. And China has always been focusing on emphasizing on mutual reliance, mutual win-win situation, enhancing win-win situation, and advocating for the importance of self-reliance in all fronts of international relations. And in terms of its relationship with the EU, China has always been focusing on its important mutual dependent relationship with the EU, with a huge potential to grow on many fronts. For example, sustainable renewable energy, sustainable development, and cultural cooperation, and of course on the electric vehicle side as well.
Well, you mentioned electric vehicles, so Timo, I want to bring you in now, because there are some pressure points, aren't there, between the EU and China, and I'm thinking in particular about electric vehicles. Why do you think there's been so little progress in negotiations between the EU and China to resolve disputes over EVs?
My view is a bit more positive. It's only less than 2 months that there was this decision by the EU on these tariffs, and since then there has been progress in negotiations, and I think they are rather constructive in a way. So both sides are looking for a better deal, a better ways of resolving this issue, and there has been some positive ideas from both sides. So I'm sure that this will prove to not to be as bad as we've expected.
Xi Jinping has said that developing new energy vehicles is the only way for China to go from being a great automobile country to an automobile power. I wonder, how is China driving global EV sales where Europe may be stalling?
Well, first of all, I don't think this is EU stalling, or particularly just EU stalling. China has always been focusing on developing the EU vehicles for many years, and the breakthrough only came in the recent couple of years. So, I mean, just like many other technological advancements, humankind are always moving forwards, and there are crises happening all around. We just need to work together to move the entire humanities forward, EU vehicle included. In reaction to China's leading position in sort of a EU vehicle, again, China cannot be leading alone. Electric vehicle is a systematic industry, so which means you would have to include battery innovation in battery. You have to make innovation in power grid. Tons of innovations. It's a very long supply chain. So which means we need, again, a global cooperation. And recently, China has negotiated a deal of knowledge transfer on battery technology with EU countries, Belgium specific. So that's I think that's a sort of a very positive signs for to communities moving forward.
Timo, I can see you're nodding away to that. You know, Ursula von der Leyen's message has been to make Europe more competitive and to keep pace with China and the rest of the world. But I'm sticking with EVs here because EV sales in Europe have been weak, well, certainly in some of the biggest economies, including Germany, France and Italy. Can Europe ever keep up with China?
Well, it's too early to say. I think the jury is still out on this one. And I think also the tariffs that had been proposed in October were also restrained to a point. But the US policy has been much more blunt, and also the tariffs have been much steeper. But we haven't seen any retaliation or much complaint from the Chinese side either. So this is interesting if we think about the triangle US, Europe, China, that this perhaps this reflects China's priorities on geopolitical powers. I don't know, but the reactions to EU have been very different than the reactions to the US tariffs. And with the incoming Trump administration, it's going to be really interesting how this triangle is going to play out.
Let's talk about building relationships. John, 2024 saw many European leaders heading to Beijing to mark and cement diplomatic ties. I mean, do you expect to see more of that in 2025 as we run up to the 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties between China and the EU?
I think, yes, of course. Politicians from Europe, the EU, etc., will certainly want to engage with China, will want to deepen relations where they can. I mean, China is the world's second biggest economy. It's the third biggest trading partner of the European Union. It's a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's a leader in the G20, and it's driving a multipolar world. So, of course, it's an essential partner for Europe. So this next year, the 50th anniversary year, is a good pretext, if you like, to try to reset the relationship and put it on a more positive track. That will depend on many things. It will depend on managing our trade relations in a civilized and legally sound and WTO compatible manner. It will depend, above all, on what is China's position on the Russian invasion. And it will depend on Europe being more unified than it has been to date in terms of its relations with China, both economically and politically. We see a bit of an issue at the moment with member states of the EU competing against each other for access to the Chinese market, outbidding each other for Chinese FDI into Europe, into their countries. I mean, okay, that's fine in the short term, but it's very weakening for Europe in the long term. And I hope that a future EU-China relationship will be based on recognition by both sides of the strength, which is the European Union when it works together as a single bloc.
It's interesting, you're not the first person who said that to me. Many people, analysts I'm talking to, are focusing on that EU unity and maybe some of the pressure points being disagreements or different pathways from different European countries. Now, we've had lots of European leaders go to Beijing with their own agendas, but also, Yin, there have been visits from President Xi to places in Europe. You know, I'm thinking he went to France, he went to Hungary and Serbia, all in 2024. What in particular emerged from those visits do you think is positive?
Right. His visit to this year's visit to France leads to an enhanced relationship between China and France. But it's not only just a bilateral relations. In his visit to France, he emphasized the importance of France inside EU, and it is important for China to cooperate with France as a EU member state. And so was Hungary, and he particularly recognized the importance of Hungary being the rotational president in the next year, and how this special relationship would enhance not only China and Hungary's position, but also China through Hungary to the entire EU. Same with Serbia. So I think overall, China has been quite enthusiastic in European unification. But just like in many other polities around the world, in a forever changing world, we are all in the process of soul searching. China has been in the process of soul searching in the past 2 or 3 decades, whereas now probably we're all in that position. It's since the Brexit, it's the EU's position in looking for sort of its own role and its own identity in a new era.
Which sectors do you think are ripe for further cooperation between China and EU, Timo? Is it agriculture? Is it finance? Is it technology?
Well, as our president, Mr. Stubb, just recently visited Beijing, I think a lot of areas that create the possibility for cooperation emerged there. I think action against climate crisis is something that, if we again think about this triangle US, China, Europe, that Europe and China could be more aligned with, since Europe has a very ambitious goal in climate action, and Finland in Europe the most ambitious goals. And we think that the Chinese 2060 goal is very commendable. So we could think a lot of low carbon technology solutions and cooperation could be very fruitful for both parties. And particularly, I think, in trying to help mankind to mitigate the climate crisis issue, this Chinese-European cooperation would be the key. And why not throw India in the mix as well? I think the Asian-European responsible climate policy axis would be most important.
John, I wonder, what about you? Where do you think that there's a positive tone when it comes to cooperation between China and the EU?
Obviously, there are many areas where the two blocs can work together. Food security, agriculture, GIs, as Timo said, the climate change and climate mitigation space, trade facilitation, global health policy and pandemic preparedness, triangular development aid to Africa, aviation transport, education, energy. There are many sectors. Where we will not work together, I think, is on AI, because China and Europe have taken completely different political paths when it comes to AI regulation, not on defence and security in any meaningful way. But there's a much more fundamental issue. This is all window dressing. Yeah, there has to be for real EU-China cooperation in the long term. It has to be based on fundamentally common values. One, we're in a multipolar world. I think the EU has recognised that. Yeah, we recognise China and the US and EU are the three big players in the world economy, and we can play in the margins with cooperation in different sectors, but there has to be a common understanding of the way in which we're going to manage the world economy, the world politics between the major countries and regions.
Yin, we're seeing China becoming increasingly business-friendly, with German companies continuing to invest heavily in China, like VW and BMW. But those people-to-people exchanges, when it comes to culture, when it comes to education, that's really important too, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I don't think investment, FDI, can be separated from people-to-people's exchange, because one of the goals for that China advocates is that the industrial cooperation is crucial to build self-reliance and to build a transformed industry, is a pathway towards a modernization. And so mutual investment, both on the German to China side as well as China to German side, will facilitate real change. Local people would see the real benefit of multilateral investment and cooperation in the shape of raising employment rates. And of course, along the line, if we're able to introduce greener and more sustainable industry transformed in that sort of a sustainable way, then people would definitely benefit much more than just an old style of exploitative investment.
Timo, 2024 was a huge year for elections, and we had, of course, the European elections in 2024, which saw that big shift, didn't it, in the political landscape. Many centrist-leaning parties losing ground to far more right-leaning groups. How do you see that influencing the EU's approach to China in 2025 and beyond?
Well, that is a very pertinent question, and I think one thing that we are witnessing already is a backlash to the Green Deal and the climate action that was very much on Ursula von der Leyen's first Commission's agenda, and that is very regrettable. And this is also kind of reflecting to the EV dispute as well, whereas it's not seen as important as it was before. And then the issue of EU unity is also something that is more difficult now that the landscape is more nationalistic or even xenophobic, which, as John rightly pointed out, is hugely important in the EU's attention towards China. These are hugely important issues. And then the whole issue of multilateral organizations. I see that WTO is very much in decline right now, but there are some glimmers of hope, I think, whereas John was saying that there will be no cooperation in artificial intelligence. So I am still slightly optimistic after the unanimous adoption of the Digital Global Compact in UN in September, that also included cooperation in AI issues that might also give some hope of optimism for the multilateral organizations in the future. And as long as there is some breath in these organizations, I think a country small as Finland, very export-oriented, we think that this of great importance to us and hopefully for other countries as well.
I want to pick up on something that came up earlier, the implications of Donald Trump's second presidency, and if that changes where the EU stands with China. John, let's start with trade. I mean, what's your take?
Well, I think we have to, as they say, hope for the best and prepare for the worst. It's a bit premature to predict what Trump will do, and it'll depend on whether he uses his trade policy as a way mainly to try to reduce the trade deficit with China and others, or whether he uses trade policy as a way to leverage foreign policy changes in other parts of the world. If we take the simple issue of trade, okay, so Trump is threatening to impose depends on what day of the week you read it, 60% tariff on Chinese exports, 100%, etc. Okay, he does that. I don't think he will. I think Musk will not allow him to do that because Musk has a lot of interest in China. But suppose he does it with some sectors, that will lead to a little bit of trade diversion away from the US with the markets closed for a certain sector, to Europe, to Southeast Asia, to Latin America, etc. Not so much, I don't think, because this is demand driven, not just supply led. The bigger issue is will Trump put pressure on the European Union to join the US in taking trade measures against China, punishing China, if you like? No, the EU will not do that. The EU will not take sides in any kind of trade war between the US and China. Why not? One, because we have interests in both markets. We're not going to break that. And secondly, the EU is above all a body of law. So as Timo said earlier, I think in this conversation, the EU could not impose 100% duty on electric vehicles. It has to be based on WTO consistent legal measures. Yeah. So even if the EU and the US may have a common view on the illegality of Chinese state subsidies, at least on the EU side, we will pursue that through the internationally legal channels of the WTO. And I would add finally that if there is a trade dispute or a trade war, quote unquote, between US and China, that's going to make China need the EU even more as a market, as a source of investment, as a vehicle for investment, if China is shut out of the American market. So I think China will have an interest in maintaining civilized relations with the European Union, avoiding unnecessary trade disputes, avoiding the temptation to divide and rule the EU member states, so that the economic relationship can prosper, even with a difficult US-China relationship.
There are many unknowns, and it's a very complicated and uncertain geopolitical and geoeconomic backdrop that we're operating in. But Yin, I wonder, how do you see the relationship between China and the EU developing by the end of 2025?
Well, I do agree. Based on Chinese track record, the EU has always been an important partner in China's foreign relations. So I would hope that in 2025, this relationship will continue to grow regardless of the external influences. But having said that, my hope is only just my hope. The EU has been facing external interference, not only just from its internal problems, but also from external influences from agents such as America. We have been talking about China's interference of EU, but I think it is an unfair accusation, because since the first administration of Trump, Trump administration, the interference has been growing. The surveillance on the EU member states has been a long-standing problem that many of the EU member states countries are facing since the Edward Snowden's incidents. So this has been amended. But, well, having said that, I do believe that it is important for the EU countries to recognize, as well as EU as a unity, to recognize that it is important that we're now in a multilateral world, and it is only just fair to treat all partners equally, and it's fair to adopt a non-interference policy, and it is fair to move forward as equal partners of this entire world.
Yin Zhiguang, Timo Harakka, John Clarke, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.